Justin Trudeau has been using your tax dollars to pay for the hotel bills of people who had reached the safety of places like upstate New York, illegally crossed the border into Canada, and then made a claim that they were fleeing persecution or an asylum claim. Now, you'll remember that there was a lot of outrage when this first came to light during the summer, and in order to try and take some of the media heat off, not to fix the problem, Justin Trudeau imposed, through his ministers, a deadline of September 30th of supposedly sorting all of this out and not having to do this anymore. Now, it's October the 2nd, so I stood up in the House of Commons today and I asked Bill Blair, Justin Trudeau's Minister of Nothing, who doesn't have anyone report to him, but is supposed to be in charge of fixing the situation, some very simple questions about how many people were still in hotels, how many more were going to be in hotels, and what the cost was. I want you to watch his response because I think it's a little crazy that this guy has had several months now, even though there's already a Minister of Immigration and Public Safety that should have been dealing with this like a year and a half ago, that he doesn't have a plan to deal with this, and he doesn't have the basic stats that you would think he'd be able to answer in the House of Commons. Watch that, but then stay tuned for something even crazier that just happened 5 minutes ago in my Citizenship and Immigration Committee. Watch question period first.
The Liberals told Canadians that scores of illegal border crossers would be housed in Toronto area hotels at taxpayer expense until September the 30th. Right. It's October the 2nd. They're still in hotels with more on the way. And the Liberals still won't tell Canadians how many illegal border crossers are currently in hotels, how long they will be there, how many more they expect, and what the total cost will be. So I'll ask again, how many are in hotels? How many more do they expect? How long will they be there? And what's the total cost?
Well, Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect all three orders of government to work together to live up to our legal obligations and to ensure order and safety. And that's why we've remained committed to working with both provinces and municipalities to address together the challenges that we face. The City of Toronto has been working diligently to find a permanent housing solution for the families that are currently housed in a temporary housing facility. We remain committed to working with the City of Toronto and to support them through that important work.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, it is completely ridiculous to put people up in hotels in taxpayer expense who, by the Liberals' own admissions, likely don't have valid asylum claims for years because of the hearing backlogs created by the Prime Minister's own bad practices. This is not fair to anyone, especially Canadian taxpayers who are struggling to make ends meet, whose paychecks are going to cover these hotel bills. Why should Canadians continue to pay for hotel rooms for people who have reached the safety of upstate New York and illegally entered our country?
Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, the City of Toronto has for over a decade used temporary shelter in rental accommodation at hotels in order to deal with a surplus of people requiring temporary shelter. And it is through the City of Toronto that solution was actually acquired. Mr. Speaker, we have remained committed to supporting the City of Toronto in their diligent work to find a more permanent housing solution for these individuals, and we are working very closely. I've had a recent conversation with Minister MacLeod in Ontario as we work together with the province of Ontario and the City of Toronto to address this concern.
So, Justin Trudeau's Minister of Nothing has no answers for some very basic questions. Now, 5 minutes ago in my Citizenship and Immigration Committee, something very bananas happened. The man who's supposed to be in charge of something called the Immigration and Refugee Board appeared before my committee. Now, he's a new appointment to this. He is going to be the chair of this board, and typically appointments like this appear before parliamentary committees so that parliamentarians can question or not whether or not this person would have the competency to do the job. Now, what is the Immigration and Refugee Board? This is the body that assesses whether or not somebody has a valid asylum claim. So if you came to Canada and said, I'm being persecuted, you would have to file an asylum claim, and then it would go through this board for adjudication. The problem that ties back into the problem of people being housed in hotels right now is because Justin Trudeau has allowed so many people to illegally enter Canada from the United States, one of the safest countries in the world, and then claim asylum. The Immigration Refugee Board has a massive backlog of cases. I want you to watch, and it's a bit of a long watch, it's about 10 minutes, what happened when it came to my round of questions. Because this is like a job interview, right? I wanted to understand if this person had an understanding of the scope of the problem, how he planned to fix the problem, and then whether or not he had the core competencies to actually implement that. Watch what happens, what the Liberals do when I ask him for his plan.
Ms. Rempel.
Thank you. Good luck. What a big job, an important job. So my questions relate to your planned approach to the current challenges that are facing the IRB. So I'll start just with trying to set the context. Can you give us a sense of the current inventory of cases at the IRB?
Yes, I can. It's currently about 65,000 cases at the RPD, at the Refugee Protection Division.
And if there were no more cases, let's say none for the rest of the year, it just stopped, how long do you anticipate it would take to clear that inventory?
We're processing approximately 30,000 claims a year, so 2 years.
Okay, great. And if the current volumes that we're seeing, obviously we're seeing increased volume of inventory coming into the IRB, continue at the rate that they're at, and year over year we have seen an increase. Do you project, given current resourcing, do you project that backlog growing or decreasing?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The backlog will be growing because the intake is currently greater than our capacity.
Okay. So you've identified this challenge, and frankly, I think it is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Canada right now. Just a few questions on your approach. Have you gone to the government yet with any recommendations on how to reduce that backlog? What were they, and maybe you can give us a sense on both your approach on how to decrease the intake and how to deal with the backlog, the current inventory?
I have not yet provided any recommendations to the government. I hope to be briefing the minister shortly. But I can say that you've diagnosed it correctly. The capacity is smaller than the intake at the moment, which means the backlog will grow going forward. That said, the good news is with monies received through Budget 2018, the backlog in terms of what it otherwise would have been is less, to the tune of about 20,000 over the next 2 years. The backlog is still growing, but it's growing at a slower pace than it otherwise would have, but for Budget 2018 money.
In terms of assumptions on that, what assumption are you using in terms of the intake numbers for that
going
model?
forward? Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at last year's numbers, we received about 55,000 claims over the course of the year.
So you're using about 55,000.
I'm just going on what last year's projection was.
So,
yes.
so if it was more than that, then that delta would grow.
Of course.
Okay. When do you plan on briefing the minister with regard to your potential solutions for this?
Well, we're working through options right now with the team. We're looking at a number of things, which I'm happy to try and explain the approach that we're adopting. It's not as simple as I'm sure members of this committee understand. This is not as simple as saying, look, there's a backlog of some 60,000. Therefore, how many people would it take to get rid of 60,000? But we're working through various options right now where we're looking at
just going back though, like what in terms of timeline? When do you plan on presenting that to the government?
Well, over the course of, as I indicated in my opening remarks, over the course of the next couple of months, we are putting a proposal together, working with the department, and we'll be in a position to brief the minister, I imagine, over the next few months.
Okay, great. Would you be willing to table with the committee an appropriately classified document that outlines your approaches to that particular? I think it's important for parliamentarians to understand that because the government, I would imagine, would be discussing this in terms of the federal budget. So,
Mr. Chair, no, I wouldn't be comfortable. I wouldn't. Sorry.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I respect my colleagues, need to question the I guess the witness, but we are here to discuss his qualifications and competencies as they relate to his ability to perform the duty. And I respect that there's latitude given to members here at the committee about the overall vision of Mr. Wex at the IRB, but I would suggest that it stay within the confines of questioning about the
Point of order.
capacity and performance competencies of the chair. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Just in response to that, this is like a job interview, right? So if there is a problem that is being presented in a job interview, one would want to know from the candidate their understanding of the scope of the problem, their potential approaches to dealing with the problem in order to evaluate whether or not this person has the competency to meet that. So I would say that this is very much in scope, and given the severity of, in terms of the importance on immigration policy that Mr. Wex, that he has to deal with this, I think that it is in scope. I don't see how it wouldn't be.
I would agree that your explanation is in scope, but I think requesting the tabling of a document that we don't know exists or we don't know what it is would not be in scope. But it is very fair to ask the witness what his vision is, but I don't think it would be within scope to ask him to table a document that doesn't yet exist.
Just in terms of a question on that, why wouldn't we want to know what this person's plan is for dealing with a 65,000 case inventory as parliamentarians? I'd just like to hear your rationale for that.
I don't, it's not my rationale.
Well, it is.
It's
on the same
the
point of
reality is that we have a witness here who has, you've asked a question, and I think it's very fair to ask him his plans. That is very fair.
So, but you just contradicted yourself, Mr.
But not
Chair.
to ask him to table a document that doesn't exist yet.
Well, with respect, you just contradicted yourself because you just said it was appropriate to ask for his plan. I asked for his plan, and then you said he shouldn't table his plan. So can you just explain to the committee why you feel...
Tabling it, I think it's very appropriate to ask for his plan.
So I
That is a
asked for
normal
it.
thing. But to ask him to table a document, I think is outside the scope because we don't know if that document exists. We don't know the confidentiality of that document. But you can ask it anyway, but he doesn't need to give it.
But to be fair, Mr. Chair, okay, then I move, Mr. Chair, that Mr. Wex table his plan, per your words, I will use your word, his plan to address the 65,000 case inventory processing with this committee.
We have a motion on the floor. I just want to consult with the clerk for a moment.
I've never heard a parliamentary secretary speak before. Welcome. No.
I did.
They were the only ones allowed.
I did.
Did you?
Yeah, I did all the time.
There is a motion that is on the floor. It is an admissible motion. Is there any discussion? Okay.
I would just say that I think the witness had already sort of made clear that he'd be tabling it to cabinet, so to the minister. So, I mean, asking somebody to table bureaucratic instructions that are going to be used by cabinet before they make a decision, I think is inappropriate to be at.
Just to clarify, on this, I'm not asking Mr. Wex to table any sort of cabinet direction. I think that at this point in time, if the IRB doesn't have a plan to address the inventory and can't table that to Parliament, that's probably very problematic. Perhaps I would ask Mr. Wex to clarify if there is a plan to address that. This is, and just to my colleagues, I mean, our goal as parliamentarians here, we should be asking Mr. DeCourcy whether or not the government has a plan to address this. The government keeps talking about resourcing. Mr. Chair, I'll point out too, there was a Globe and Mail article about 2 weeks ago where the minister who is now in charge of this file said that the IRB inventory would be reduced, but then the IRB actually contradicted the minister and said it wouldn't. So I think in terms of addressing Mr. Wex's competency in filling a very serious role, I would like to know what his plan is. I would like to also evaluate that in terms of why the minister would contradict Mr. Wex's own department. I wouldn't think that that information would be cabinet confidence. I think that that's basic operation of government that his staff at the IRB would have, and I would like to evaluate that as a parliamentarian.
Unfortunately, Mr. Wex isn't able to answer in a debate on the motion. Mr. DeCourcy and then Ms. Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can understand why my colleague would want that, but I would remind her, through you, Mr. Chair, that we're here pursuant to Standing Orders 110 and 111. And if we look at paragraph 2 of Standing Order 111, it will read that the committee, if it should call an appointee or nominee to appear pursuant to Section 1 of the Standing Order, shall examine the qualifications and competence of the appointee or nominee to perform the duties of the post to which he or she has been appointed or nominated. I would agree that there should be latitude for the witness to talk about overall vision, but we are not here to discuss the particulars of what the chair to the IRB will be doing. That would be pursuant to a whole other request to have that witness come before this committee, and that's what I was alluding to when I first intervened.
Thank you. Ms. Huan?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just on that question, and with all due respect to the parliamentary secretary, I think we heard from Mr. Wax actually in his presentation as he was actually about to outline some of the options to which they were entertaining. I don't know why we always do this. We get into this situation where we bicker about nothing and then we get no information at all that is important to the job of what we're trying to do here. Maybe we can kind of get on with it. I think that I would support, of course, the request for tabling of information. I always think that the sharing of information amongst all parliamentarians is useful and helpful in finding solutions in a difficult situation. And what we don't want to see, of course, is the misinformation that's being spread out there around the asylum seekers, in which I don't think is good for Canada at all, for anybody at all. And so the IRB has an important role to play, no question about that. We rely on them to do this work diligently. They deserve to have the resources that's necessary. They have a report that's before them, the Yates report with many recommendations. I would love to hear from Mr. Wax about what the plan is forward, what he's thinking as a new sheriff in town, I guess, at the IRB, and how we can move forward to deal with the challenges ahead of us. So please, Mr. Chair, maybe we can sort of get on with it. I will support, of course, the motion tabled by my colleague, Ms. Rempel, but really, I would really just urge for all members to sort of step down from their podium and see if we can find a way forward to trying to look at the issues in a way that's, I think, useful and helpful for everyone.
Ms. Rempel?
I would just like to build on both my colleague, Mr. De Courcy, and Ms. Kwan's comments. So first of all, with regard to the standing order that Mr. De Courcy mentioned, we only have an hour to examine this, and this is a fairly weighty policy matter. I think it is completely, I mean, I've conducted hundreds of job interviews in my life, and one of the exercises I often use to determine the competency of someone who frankly has been on the job for 2 months already is, do you have a plan? What would you do in this situation? What are you going to do with it? And given that there are, close to $1 billion worth of expenses now associated with the crisis at Roxham Road and the backlog associated with the IRB backlog, I think a plan, I don't agree with the assertion this is confidential information, and if it is, that's ridiculous. That should be tabled with this committee. I want that information. So I frankly don't agree with you, Mr. De Courcy. I think it's frankly spin to try and not have information in front of this committee, real change. To my colleague, Ms. Kwan, I agree we should move on with these things, but sometimes, I mean, there's something that's worth fighting for. Like, why can't we have a document from the IRB that's like, I'm sure Mr. Wex is quite competent. I'm sure he'd love the opportunity to table with committee some assumptions around what the intake is going to be, the resource assumptions that are going to be required to reduce the inventory over a certain period of time. These are, I don't understand why as parliamentarians, especially going into a budgetary cycle, we wouldn't want to look at that information. Frankly, if my Liberal colleagues vote this down, why would Parliament not want to examine this information? I'm sure Mr. Wex will provide something that is suitably sanitized to allay the concerns of my colleagues opposite, that would be a routine document that would be provided to this committee. So I would like to do that. I'm sure you guys will be able to crow about whatever you're trying to do in it. I don't think this is a frightening exercise by any point, but the only reason to vote this down is you have something to hide. So don't hide this. Move on.
Mr. De Courcy and Mr. Whalen.
If the member wants that information, there are ways that information could potentially be sought. This committee is undertaking a study on migration patterns in the 21st century, but today we're here pursuant to the standing orders written in parliamentary procedure. I would think that my colleagues would not want to circumvent those standing orders nor parliamentary procedure for the sake of for the sake of getting what they want today. There are ways to do this, and I was merely referencing the reason that this committee was brought together today for this testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Whalen.
If Ms. Rempel's okay with inviting the witness back once the document is prepared, then we'd entertain that.
Are you suggesting an amendment?
So I suggest not to try to belabor it, but if it's a friendly amendment to invite Mr. Wex back once this document is prepared to discuss the IRB's plan to achieve a reduction and elimination of the backlog, happy to schedule another meeting on that.
I'm
and
not
have the
so good
document.
on either friendly or unfriendly amendments. I would like, if you would like to make an amendment,
Yes.
I would entertain an amendment to the motion. That you're amending the motion to have such an opportunity to discuss the plan at a future date by inviting the chairperson back. That is an amendment. We'd like to discuss the amendment.
Given that Mr. Wex has suggested that they would be in a position to have this done within a 2-month period, I would request that that meeting happen before the Christmas recess, if my colleague is amenable to that.
If the document is prepared before Christmas, absolutely.
I would suggest that we
This
put a
is a
hard
sub-amendment?
Yes, I would suggest that this would happen before Christmas.
Okay, so we have a sub-amendment I need to debate first. Seeing no debate on it, all in favor of putting a time limit to before Christmas? Opposed? That is defeated. It's now on the amendment that we invite the witness back at an appropriate time to present such a plan. Ms. Rempel.
So my colleagues in the Liberal Party just voted down an amendment to have the IRB chair come back to talk about his plan, even though he himself in testimony today said that he would be in a position to have this done within a 2-month period. So I would just like to put on the record that the voting down of that particular amendment was likely because they plan to never have him back on this. So
Is that true?
I don't understand, first of all, why we can't just have a document tabled, why we can't just have a document tabled with this committee on fairly routine information, why the Liberals would vote that down, and I would just postulate, Mr. Chair, that that is because they don't want to have that, and they have something to hide. Perhaps because
Rest
they have a
assured, if
minister
this
of nothing.
committee passes a motion to invite a witness, the witness will be invited. Ms. Kwan, and then Mr. Whalen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think that I would like to move a sub-amendment with respect to timeline. I think that it seems to me that the government members are concerned that maybe the document may not be tabled by the end of Christmas. However, that said, there's some anticipation that perhaps this material or this work will be completed within 2 months' time. So why don't we make this suggestion that upon the completion of the report, that within the week, that Mr. Wax be invited back to this committee so that we can actually have that discussion. I think that's fair. Table it, the government has it, and then we can actually look at it as parliamentarians and to move forward.
Could I hear the amendment again?
So my sub-amendment would be to add in the timeline that upon tabling of the report from Mr. Wax to the government, that within a week the committee
Following
invites
the
him,
tabling.
the following week, to invite him to come to the committee to have a committee meeting on the issue.
So we have a second sub-amendment. Any discussion? Ms. Rempel.
I support this sub-amendment, but I'd like to just put some information out for context. It is so imperative that the IRB tell the government, parliamentarians, and Canadians how they plan to address the backlog and the dramatically building inventory of cases within the IRB and what advice they're presenting that they would like Parliament to undertake in that regard, especially if there's potential policy changes that might be required. Because, we're at October the 2nd. We have people staying in hotels in the Greater Toronto area at the taxpayer expense because the IRB has a case log backlog. So this has a direct impact on budgetary expenditures related to the housing of people who have illegally entered the country and then subsequently claimed asylum. It has a direct impact on federal-provincial relationships with regard to the committee that's happening, and it has a direct impact on whether or not we are in a position to evaluate any sort of supplementary estimates that might be presented to this committee. And I hope that anybody who is watching this realize how ridiculous it is that
we would be having any discussion about tabling a report on this, given the severity and gravity of this particular issue. Thank you.
Mr. Hope.
Je crois que tout le monde autour.
Well, I think everyone around the table is seeking the same thing, in that we want information. So there's no doubt about the committee wanting information, but maybe the way of getting the information is different. Now here we're splitting hairs over the issue of when Mr. Wex will bring out a document, a recommendation, and now I agree with Mr. DeCourcy. We're here to learn about his competence and qualifications for the position before even finished asking some questions, before finishing with our questions. We're seeking to get information on work that he will do. Now, there's no problem with getting the information on the work that he's going to do because we can invite him back more than once even. I don't have a problem with inviting him back as a witness. But today what we're here to do is to examine his qualifications and competence. So now we've got a sub-amendment to a motion to review or to bring the witness back to talk about a document and another document. At any rate, this, once a document is ready, regardless of the document, once there's additional information and we need to have the witness back, then we simply have to invite him. It's as simple as that.
Mon ajout à la motion supplémentaire.
So that's my comment on the motion.
I asked a very simple question that I think Mr. Wex would have agreed to do. We had to move a motion to do this. I don't understand why the government is so reticent to provide information on how it's going to deal with a 65,000 inventory backlog. Again, if this I strongly support the sub-amendment, and that, again, to reemphasize what that is that once Mr. Wex provides a document to the government, and again, I don't understand why that doesn't exist right now. I would question competency, to be perfectly honest. I don't understand how we don't have a plan to deal with this, given how many cases there are. This should be able to be produced now, I would argue, but if this can't be produced in a 2-month period, how many more cases are we going to have? The sub-amendment makes perfect sense. Everybody should vote for it. And if they don't vote for it, I would again postulate the motivation would be to hide a lack of a plan.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire.
I was just saying that I can't certainly understand why there wouldn't be why anyone would be against this sub-amendment as well, because it's tabling it 1 week after. I agree that there may have, whether Mr. X has had time to put a new plan together or not, I don't think is part of the issue. There should have been a plan when he was there before and still be available now, so we could ask for that plan as well and another one in 2 weeks' time or 2 months' time. But I think this is appropriate. Have him back within a week of a tabling of such a plan.
Thank you. Seeing no other debate, there is now a sub-amendment which requires the witness to table a report with the committee 1 week following its presentation to government. All in favor? Opposed? And that is defeated. We now come to the amended motion, which is the amendment on the motion, rather, which is the witness be invited to committee to discuss his plan when it's available. Ms. Rempel.
So just
I would just remind all members that I won't entertain people repeating their points at this point.
But I just do want to clarify that the amendment that we're voting on now has no timeline for the presentation of a plan to the committee, no firm obligation for, like, there's no timeline, so there's no, in essence, no firm obligation. So I would just suggest that that's because there is no plan, has been demonstrated by the government's lack of ability to answer basic questions on this. And I would just suggest that the government voting down these two sub-amendments, which put some timelines around this, suggests that, again, there is no plan.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment? Opposed? It is carried. Now we are at the amended motion. The amended motion has some difficulty in it without the amendment, frankly, because it's impossible to request a document not prepared. And probably we are attempting to find it in the standing orders, which I think it is there, that we can't request a document. However, as now amended, I think the motion does stand well, and that is that the witness be invited to, the chairperson be invited to be invited to this committee to present his plan following its presentation to the government. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Okay, we have about 18 minutes. Ms. Rempel, you have 3 minutes left.
Thank you. Mr. Wex, since I can't talk about any plans that you might have or address how your competency might be able to achieve that plan, perhaps we can go more back to the scope of the problem and how you would address it. One of the things that has come up with some of your predecessors in front of this committee is addressing some of the IRB's practices, addressing some of the potential pull factors for people who might come into the asylum system who don't have valid asylum claims and ways to reduce that. Do you have a sense that, or is it your understanding that perhaps the wait times that are being created for people who are claiming asylum in Canada, especially through Roxham Road, that might create a potential pull factor for people coming into Canada, in that people know that they have at least 2 years plus before their asylum claim is being heard, so therefore they could come into the country, and that's creating a pull for people to enter the country this way?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have heard of that, and I understand why some people would say that. I have not reviewed any documentation or any evidence to support it, but that's not to say that it doesn't exist. I know that that's an idea that's out there that has some sense of reason to it, but I can't say that I've seen or read anything that would empirically support it.
You talked in your opening remarks about a desire to reach out to stakeholders to get a better understanding of some of the challenges. Would your consultation with stakeholders include doing some research on this particular phenomenon?
I haven't considered that before, Mr. Chair. I have no objection to looking into that matter. I think it's an interesting question. I can undertake to consider that further in the context of my responsibilities. Thank you. In terms of the Yates report, there are 2 models for asylum determination being proposed. One of the models would see the IRB fall under the Minister of IRCC, and this would mean that the IRB is no longer independent. Do you support this model? Mr. Chair, thank you very much for that question. I think that that's a hypothetical question at this point in terms of a new agency. I understand the spirit within which it was made to try and integrate a whole bunch of issues that are currently dispersed across 3 parties into one. My own experience over the past number of years with machinery changes, which rests with the prerogative of the Prime Minister, of course, is that there are significant transaction costs associated with them, and they would need to be carefully considered prior to moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I hope you're as outraged as I was in that committee that the Liberals purposely voted down a motion to get information about a plan. You know, these guys are muzzling people like Richard Wex, who is supposed to be in front of parliamentary committee to tell us what they're doing to solve this problem. And to tie it all together, folks, the problem with the hotel bills is that the longer that people have to wait to have their asylum claims adjudicated, the longer what? Justin Trudeau is going to pay for them to be in hotels. Now, here's the thing. None of this should be happening because Justin Trudeau should have gone to the American administration and renegotiated the Safe Third Country Agreement to prevent this loophole that's allowing people to come into the country in the first place. You've heard me talk about this I don't know how many times now. This is one of the first things that a conservative government would do. We would definitely negotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement to ensure that it applies to the entire border. We would look at our own legislative mechanisms to make sure that this stops. And, you know, I've talked to you many times about many other things that we could do to stop people from abusing our asylum system in this way. But at the very least, Justin Trudeau should be working with the Immigration Refugee Board to do two things: to stop the flow of people that probably don't likely have valid asylum claims to begin with, given that they're coming from the United States of America, to make sure that we are reducing the intake, and then also ensuring that there's a plan to clear that backlog so that we don't have to put people in hotels. You know, I get really frustrated every day because these are some basic skills that any of you who are watching, if you were in Parliament here, if you were in charge of this, you would undertake these things. So what is very frustrating to me is to watch these big, high-salaried Liberals do nothing day after day and allow the complete disintegration of the integrity of Canada's immigration system. That's not going to stop me from fighting for you. And frankly, at this point in time, we need a change in government. We need a Conservative government to set things right. Working hard for you in Ottawa. I'm going to get back into committee and keep holding these guys to account. Have a great day.